Hi. So I'm in a situation right now that's too personal, and I can't imagine myself sharing this with my close friends. So I'm here asking Reddit for an unbiased verdict instead. My dad passed away recently, like you might have already guessed, but I had no idea up until a week ago when his lawyer called me to inform me of his demise. I didn't know how to feel because I really didn't share a good relationship with my father and I hadn't spoken to him in over 10 years. I'm a 23-year-old guy now, and back when I was 12 or 13, my dad abandoned my mother and I and terminated his parental rights because he didn't think I was his child. After almost 13 years of raising me, he left abruptly and without an explanation. My mom didn't have any proper answers for me back then because I was too young. But years later, after I was old enough, she explained to me that my dad had believed that she'd been cheating on him with his brother due to their friendship. My mom and her brother in law went to the same high school, but my dad didn't, and he'd always felt a little out of the loop around them whenever they'd reunite at family events and holidays. This made him kind of insecure and jealous, and eventually it got to a point where they'd start fighting over their friendship, and my dad had begun suspecting her of infidelity, even though she'd been nothing but loyal to him. She even tried to tell him that she'd stop talking to her brother in law and get a paternity test done as well. But my dad, being the kind of guy that he is, simply left and didn't bother to confirm if what he believed was true or not. My mom let him leave because if he wasn't even willing to believe a paternity test, then there was very little scope for their relationship to improve. She told me that she believed that he was the one who was probably already engaged in an affair, and the reason he was so up in arms about her friendship with his brother was because he was projecting, which could be the case, but we'll never know. After their divorce was finalized, he moved out of state and cut ties with everyone from here, including all his friends and family, which seemed a little excessive. But as you guys may have gathered by now, everything about my dad was excessive since he clearly didn't believe in the concept of moderation. Anyway, my mother and I didn't even see him or speak to him again after he left, even though I did miss him a lot. My mother was capable enough to raise me on her own with some help from her family, and she also kept in touch with her friend, my uncle, and is still going steady with him. I thought that was a little weird, but she told me that she'd been friends with this guy for ages and she wasn't going to let such a friendship go just because of her ex-husband's insecurities and jealousy, which was a fair point. And my dad wasn't a part of their lives anymore, so it didn't make sense to sever ties either. If I'm being honest, I appreciated it because my uncle was a great guy. After my dad left, he kind of took over the whole dad thing so that I wouldn't feel like I didn't have a dad. He's the one who taught me how to shave and picked me up after all my football games. And he also bought me my first car, a second-hand one, but it was still a huge deal for both my mother and me. A lot of people, including me, did wonder why they didn't get married later on, but honestly, I think it's just platonic between them. My mother has had a couple of boyfriends after I graduated high school, and my uncle's been in a couple of relationships too. He's dating someone currently as well, but they've never, ever even discussed dating each other, and obviously, I can't bring it up with either of them because that'd be weird. My point is, my dad's suspicions were all unfounded because 10 years have passed since he left. But my mother and my uncle still haven't even considered getting together. So they were never going to get together in the first place. He had nothing to worry about, and I feel like my mother was right. He just wanted an excuse to leave us, and her friendship with his brother was just the perfect opportunity for him to make an issue out of absolutely nothing and then leave while playing the victim, even though he's the one who left his wife and 13-year-old son on the basis of a hunch, which wasn't even true. So we all know who's really in the wrong here. Once I found out the real reason why my dad had left, I found it very difficult to bring myself to forgive him and think of him as my father and someone I'd like to have a relationship with ever again. I felt wronged on a personal level, and I decided that he was gone for good and that even if he approached me again to make amends, I wouldn't forgive him. And it did happen about 5 years ago when he tried to reach out to me through Facebook when he saw that I graduated and wanted to congratulate me. He sent a message saying that it was wonderful for him to have the privilege of watching me grow up, even if it was from afar, and that he would love to take me out for lunch if that was something I'd be willing to do, despite whatever happened in the past. He explained that he hadn't been in the right state of mind back then and had made a lot of mistakes, leaving us being the worst of them. And since he didn't have the courage to directly approach my mother and ask her for forgiveness and a second chance, he decided to ask me for it instead. I read that message and tried to feel moved or hurt or anything at all, but felt nothing except anger and disgust at the fact that he even thought that I would just forgive him after what he did. He walked out on me as a teenager without even bothering to find out whether or not I was his son. So now, even if he was my biological father, I didn't believe that I had anything to do with him. And I didn't, since after he left, he didn't bother to reach out to me until I graduated, which is a long time. So he was no longer welcome to fix our relationship, since now there wasn't one to begin with either. I sent him a message saying that I wasn't interested in speaking to him and that I wanted him to stay away from me and my mother for the rest of our lives, and then blocked him. I hadn't blocked him earlier because I didn't know what the account name was, since he used a fake name due to privacy reasons. But after I did, I felt relieved that he was finally out of our lives for good now. And I felt so vindicated. I never told my mother about it because I didn't want to bother her by bringing up something that she seemed to have forgotten. So she never found out about my dad's attempt to get back in touch with me. And at the time, I didn't think that it was necessary to inform her either, because if he wanted to reach out to her, then he could message her separately and didn't need to go through me. Although I do think that I should have probably worded the message I sent to my dad a little differently, so he wouldn't think that neither my mother nor I were willing to rebuild our relationship with him, because to be honest, I don't know what my mom wanted, and I guess I might have made a mistake by sending that message without consulting with her first. Regardless, that was my last interaction with my dad, after which he didn't try to contact me at all, even though he knew where to find me. So I assumed that he must have let it go, and I moved on with my life too. Coming to the recent past, 1 week ago, I received a call from my dad's lawyer telling me that my father had passed away about a month ago and that I needed to meet him since there was money involved. I was shocked at the news of my dad's demise, but I still tried to compose myself and told his lawyer that whatever money there was, I didn't need it, and that I would like to be left out of this altogether. I was about to hang up when he informed me that I wasn't going to inherit anything, but instead he was contacting me about the money that I owed him. Now that came as a shock to me, because I didn't think that I owed my father anything at all, and I had no idea what his lawyer was talking about. I hadn't ever loaned any money from him as far as I remember, and as for whatever he spent on me during my childhood, I don't think I owed him that amount, since I was literally a child. I told his lawyer that I didn't owe him any money and that he must be mistaken, but he insisted that I did take a loan of about $20,000 from him 3 years ago, and now he needed it to be returned so that it could be used to settle his medical bills. I was in shock, since I really hadn't taken any amount from him, and like I said, the last time I'd spoken to him was when I'd graduated, and even then I'd only told him to stay away from my mother and me. Eventually his lawyer told me that my mother had co-signed this loan with me and I could ask her if I wanted to. And that was odd because, as far as I knew, my mother wouldn't even ask my dad for a pen if it really came down to it. And here, we'd apparently taken the loan of $20,000 from my dad. I told the lawyer that I'd get in touch with him later and immediately made my way to my mother's place to ask her about what was going on. Once I got there and asked her about it, she got really serious and told me that this was none of my business and that I wasn't supposed to answer any more calls from his lawyer, which just confirmed that something fishy was going on here. I would have followed my mom's orders without thinking twice had I been in high school, but obviously I'm an adult now with my own life and responsibilities. So I couldn't afford to be a part of something that wasn't legally all right. And I pushed my mom to tell me exactly what was going on, but she refused and said that I needed to mind my own business. But now that I'd received a call from his lawyer, this was now part of my business because clearly she'd been up to something and I absolutely had to get to the bottom of it. So I kept pushing and pushing until she snapped at me and told me that I needed to stay out of this or else she'd cut me out of her life instead. That was really hurtful and I was stung because of what she said, and on top of that, the way she said it too. She'd been really rude to me, and my mother is usually an even-tempered person who rarely loses her cool, so it felt really weird to see her so flustered. I also felt very frustrated because of the way she was acting, because I had absolutely every right to demand an explanation for what was happening because I just received a call from a lawyer regarding some loan that I didn't even know about. And yet, somehow it existed, and I was the one who was being questioned about it. So this did concern me, and my mother just kept trying to infantilize me and push me aside as if this was totally normal. And on top of that, she had the audacity to be disrespectful towards me, even though she was the one who'd definitely been up to something shady. So I lost my temper at her as well and ended up saying something that I kind of regret, and I think I was out of line for saying it. I told her that if this was the way she treated Dad when he was around, then it's no surprise that he left because it's very obvious that she cannot be trusted, and I don't blame him for abandoning us. And as if that wasn't bad enough on its own, I also added that maybe he wasn't even my real father, and I should probably start calling my uncle Dad now that he's gone. I don't know where it came from or why I said it. Probably because I was feeling very emotional at the time, since I just learned that my real father was gone forever and I'd never get to see him again. But even while I was saying all these horrible things to my mother, I could tell that it was beyond cruel. Before I could think of anything else, I left in a hurry and drove myself back home, and then I finally broke down and let myself cry the tears that I'd been holding back for about an hour or more. The bottom line is that I felt really awful about what I said to my mother because regardless of whatever was happening right now, she'd been a great mother to me, and I loved her. I also felt terrible about my dad's passing, even though we hadn't been in touch for ages. But it still felt like crap. So I was going through a lot of things in my head when I said what I said to my mother, and I'm afraid that I crossed a line there and overreacted. The lawyer who contacted me told me a day later that I no longer needed to come and meet him and that the issue had been resolved, and I'm sure that my mother had set things straight. But she didn't contact me and hasn't answered my calls or texts ever since I left that day. I feel like crap about what I said and for making the situation about her personal relationships when the argument wasn't even about that in the first place. At the same time, though, I think that she does owe me an explanation because my name had popped up in something serious, but for some reason she didn't think she needed to tell me what was going on. I'm an adult now and not a child who wouldn't be able to handle whatever it was that she needed to tell me. She obviously needed the money for something, I don't know what yet, and used my name to take the loan, and I don't know if it's morally right or wrong to borrow money from your ex-husband who abandoned you and then hide it from your son who's apparently co-signed that loan. I'm trying to convince myself that maybe she did make me sign it sometime because Otherwise, it's just forgery. But I'm not ready to believe that just yet. My biggest issue right now is that she and I aren't even talking right now because of what I said, and I think I might have seriously messed up here. AITA for trying to humiliate my mother by bringing up her failed marriage and alleged involvement with my uncle when she refused to tell me the truth about the money that my estranged father had loaned us. Update 1. Hey everybody, so a couple of days have passed since I put up my original post, and after reading all the comments and messages, I think I realized that while what I said was messed up, what my mother did was even more messed up, because she literally took a loan from my dad, and apparently I was the co-signer, but I didn't even know about it. Obviously there was something shady going on there, but she didn't think that it was important enough to tell me what she was doing. And even now, she was trying to evade accountability for what happened by trying to dismiss my concerns and claiming that whatever she does is none of my business. Which I agree with them. She doesn't owe me an explanation for every single thing she does. But if I'm involved in any capacity at all, then I think she needs to keep me in the loop and be honest with me. There's just no two ways about it. I'll admit that what I said to her was harsh and kind of cruel, given that she'd devoted her life to raising me and done a commendable job as a single mom, to be honest. But I did try to make things right by trying to talk to her afterwards, and she's the one who didn't think I deserved to be spoken to and is avoiding me even now. I've accepted it, though, and right now I'm only concerned about whether I'll have to face any legal trouble in the future or not. I've already spoken to my lawyer about it, thanks for the suggestion, but I'd spoken to a friend of mine who's a lawyer right away after I got to know about the loan. I have nothing to worry about as of now, since my dad's lawyer hasn't been in touch with me since he texted me saying that the issue has been resolved. So I'm guessing that my mother did something to pay her debts or whatever, but I still don't know what really happened. I've texted her again and again for an answer, but with no luck, and I don't think there's any use now texting her time and again. So if she doesn't get back to me within this week, then I'll just go to her house and ask her to tell me the truth about what happened. I just have no other choice now. Update 2. I guess I didn't need to visit my mother because she visited me today. I don't even know where to start right now, because now that I finally know the truth, it's all even more confusing to me in my head, because I just can't imagine that my mother would keep such a huge secret from me for so many years. She insisted it was none of my business, but even then, it's just so crazy that I can't even think of her as the same person anymore. So she visited me today, almost 2 weeks after our fight, and she was apologetic, but I made it clear that I couldn't forgive her fully until she told me what had happened. I also did apologize for what I said, because that was absolutely unacceptable. And I'd just gotten way too carried away by my emotions at the time, but I now knew that it wasn't cool after all. She finally told me that a couple of years back, around the same time that my dad had reached out to me, he'd also contacted my mother, and she'd been willing to work on their relationship back then. He'd moved back here around that time, and they'd even been out together a few times. So they'd been on good terms after that, and she'd found out that one of the biggest reasons he'd left us was because he'd been suffering from bipolar disorder for a while and just wanted a fresh start in a new city, because he was finding it stifling to remain in the same city and deal with the people who he knew would inevitably end up judging him if they knew about his condition. So he left, and my mother said she respected that, since at least he'd admitted that he'd messed up. They'd been working on their relationship since then, and they'd wanted to tell me after a year or so, but before they could break the news to me, my dad was diagnosed with third-stage pancreatic cancer, and it wasn't looking good for him. So my parents decided not to tell me just yet, and all their plans of getting back together were put on hold indefinitely. And I never found out about any of it, because my mother put up a wonderful show of being perfectly fine. As for the loan, that had been for my uncle and not for our personal use. My uncle had told my mother that he'd run into some financial trouble with his business, and to clear his debts, he needed $20,000 at the earliest. But unfortunately, nobody that we knew personally was ready to just hand over that sort of amount at the drop of a hat. The only person my mother was sure would help her out was my dad, because obviously he was smitten with her and would do anything for her. But the hitch was that he wouldn't lend her the money if she told him the truth, that it was for his brother, since my dad didn't want any contact with his family because apparently they'd all treated him horribly growing up and had always made him feel unwanted and put him second to his brother, which was probably the reason he was so insecure when it came to his brother. It all added up, and my uncle also never did anything to make my dad feel better, since he lived for being in the limelight and didn't care that his older brother was being mistreated, which made things worse for them as they grew up and led to all the drama. And that's why my mother had to lie to my dad and tell him that she needed the money for my tuition, but since it was a huge amount, he couldn't just give it away without knowing that he'd get it back at some point. So he got it done legally, and my mother was finally able to help my uncle out, and everything was just fine. They sort of forgot about the whole loan altogether once my dad's health worsened, and it only came back to them now that he'd passed away after he'd succumbed to his disease. His lawyer had clear instructions not to use money from the inheritance, my inheritance, to pay off his medical debt, so he collected the money from my mother and used that instead, along with my dad's savings, leaving my inheritance intact. The reason he'd even contacted me instead of my mother was because he'd messed up and thought that I was the primary obliger instead of my mother, and had he not made that mistake, I never would have found out about the loan at all. And this would all be buried like a secret for the rest of my life. After my mother told me everything, I told her that I needed time to think and I couldn't just go back to our normal relationship like nothing ever happened, and she told me she understood and then left. I knew that this wasn't the reaction she'd hoped for, since she looked very upset, but very honestly, I can't imagine myself ever going back to the relationship we had before this, because my mother had pretty much been lying to me for almost 6 years. She didn't even tell me that my dad was sick, nor did she tell me when he'd passed away, so I don't think I can bring myself to trust my mother ever again. She'd used my dad and me, which was just so weird to think about. And even though I still have mixed feelings towards my dad, I can't say that my feelings about my mother are that positive anymore. I just feel like my entire family has let me down in ways that I didn't even know were possible. My mother actually committed forgery to help my uncle out, and while I hate to be the one to say it, I'm not so sure they never had a thing together. I would love to remain deluded and think otherwise, but after today, I just don't think I can go back to that ever again. Not anymore. I'm just so lost and disappointed right now. It feels like I have nobody left anymore. And it's a horrible feeling, but it's okay. I'll get through it. Thank you so much to everyone here who was here for me. Update 3. Hi, I'm back here again after almost 3 months. So I inherited my dad's old house and a significant amount of money from him, which was nice. Doesn't make up for his absence while I was growing up, but hey, it's still something. My mother and I are no longer on talking terms after I told her that what she did was messed up, and she refused to acknowledge that she'd been in the wrong, so there was no point arguing with her, and it was better for us to go our separate ways since she was pretty adamant that she did the right thing. Whatever floats her boat, I don't care anymore, because what she did was something I cannot just forgive and forget. Believe me, I tried, but I just cannot. It's not possible. My uncle's getting married next month, so maybe what I thought about him and my mom wasn't true, but then again, I can never be sure. I was invited, but I'm not attending for obvious reasons. He'd been in on the whole thing and had no qualms about it. So that's my family for you guys. It's messed up. But like I said, I'm trying to move past this and let them all go because I still have a whole life ahead of me and I can't let them hold me back. I'm also getting therapy to help me keep a clear head and not let these things get to me anymore. And I think it does help. It's just been a couple of months, but I feel relatively better. And once again, thanks to everyone here who reached out to me with their kind words. It means the world to me, honestly. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl